What if the member everyone calls the visual has actually been hiding one of the sharpest musical minds in the entire group? What if behind the jokes, the dad humor, the worldwide fame for his face, there's a producer's ear that most fans have never fully given him credit for? Here's a question worth sitting with. When you think of BTS as songwriters and producers, whose name comes to mind first? RM, the leader who studies music theory like scripture, Suga, the underground rapper turned hitmaker, J-Hope, the dance machine who also writes and produces, but Jin? Most people don't even think to ask the question, and that right there might be the biggest miscalculation ARMY has made about this group. Because today, we're pulling back the curtain on Kim Seokjin, not the visual, not the meme king, not the worldwide handsome headline. We're talking about Jin, the music producer, and by the end of this video, you might realize he's been quietly shaping BTS's sound longer than almost anyone gives him credit for. Let's talk about it. To understand why this story matters, you first have to understand the box Jin got placed in. From the very beginning of BTS's career, the group's identity was built on very specific roles. There were the rappers, the ones writing verses, shaping bars, spitting fire in the group's early mixtapes. There were the vocalists, focused on riffs and runs. And then there was Jin, introduced to the world largely through his visuals, his humor, his warmth. It made him instantly lovable, but it also did something else. It made casual fans assume that was the whole story. Because here's the thing nobody tells you enough. Being the visual of a group doesn't mean that's all you are. It just means that's what got highlighted first. And underneath that spotlight, something else was quietly happening. Jin was learning, watching, absorbing. While the world was busy talking about his face, he was busy in the studio, figuring out how songs actually get built from the ground up. This is where the story starts to shift, because over the years, credited album after credited album, Jin's name started appearing in the songwriting and composing credits of BTS tracks, not as a guest, not as a formality, as an actual contributor to the sound. Songs like Awake, which Jin co-wrote, and which became one of the most emotionally resonant tracks on the Wings era, a song fans still point to as one of BTS's most underrated vocal and emotional showcases. Tracks like Epiphany, a solo moment on Love Yourself Answer that Jin co-wrote, delivering a vocal performance so powerful it's still considered one of his signature career moments. And here's where it gets interesting. These weren't songs where Jin simply showed up to sing what someone else wrote. He was in the room. He was shaping the lyrics. He was shaping the emotional direction of the song before a single note was recorded. Think about that for a second. The narrative around Jin for years was the visual who sings well, but quietly in the background, he was becoming something the industry actually respects. Far more. A writer, a creative voice with his own perspective. But that's not even the wildest part, because being a good songwriter is one thing. Understanding actual music production, the technical side, the architecture behind a song, is a completely different skill set. And this is where Jin's story gets genuinely surprising. Here's where it gets interesting, because production isn't just about writing pretty lyrics. It's about understanding structure, melody placement, arrangement, knowing why a bridge needs to lift here and not there, knowing how to build a song so it breathes. And Jin has quietly been building that skill set for years. Fans who actually dig into BTS's discography, not just the title tracks, but the deep cuts, the mixtape moments, the solo stages, start to notice a pattern. Jin's name isn't attached to just one or two songs. It's scattered across the group's catalog, growing more frequent, more confident, more technically layered as the years go on. Take Moon, his solo track from the Map of the Soul 7 album. Jin co-wrote and co-composed this song, and it wasn't just a pretty ballad thrown onto the track list. It was a deeply personal message to ARMY, built with a melody structure that fans and critics alike praised for how naturally it flowed, how effortlessly it captured warmth, without ever feeling overproduced. That word, effortless, is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, because effortless songs are almost never actually effortless to make. They're the hardest kind to build. Anyone who has tried to write something simple, something that just feels right, knows how much invisible work goes into making it sound that easy. And that's the trap most casual listeners fall into with Jin's contributions, because his solo work in particular has this signature quality, gentle, warm, unforced, that almost hides the craftsmanship underneath it. It doesn't sound like someone showing off their production skills. It sounds like someone who cared more about the feeling than the flex. But make no mistake, that restraint is a skill in itself. Now, here's a fact that tends to genuinely surprise casual fans. Jin doesn't just write lyrics and melodies from a notebook and hand them off to someone else to build. Over the years, in various behind-the-scenes content, documentaries, and interviews, members and staff have described him being actively present in the studio process, engaged in decisions about how a track should sound, not just what it should say. That's not the profile of someone who happens to have a nice voice and occasionally gets a songwriting credit. That's the profile of someone developing an actual ear for production. And here's where the story escalates even further. Because Jin's solo discography outside of BTS group releases gives an even bigger story. Tracks like Abyss, released as a solo single, and later his solo albums following his mandatory military enlistment, gave him something he'd never fully had before within the group dynamic: creative ownership over an entire body of work, start to finish. Think about what that actually requires. It's one thing to contribute a verse or a bridge to a song someone else is steering. It's an entirely different challenge to be the central creative force behind a full project, to make decisions about tone, about pacing, about which songs make the emotional arc work and which ones get left behind. Jin stepped into that role, and he didn't just survive it, he thrived in it. His solo album, Happy, released in 2024, became a commercial and critical moment that surprised even some longtime fans with how personal, how sonically considered, how deliberately crafted it felt. This wasn't a victory lap, this was a statement. But here's the question that really needs asking. If Jin has been doing this, writing, co-composing, shaping songs for this long, why does the underrated producer label still surprise people? The answer might be uncomfortable, but it's worth sitting with. Because the truth is, first impressions are incredibly hard to shake, and Jin's first impression to the world wasn't producer, it was visual. It was the funny one. It was worldwide handsome, a title he embraced with humor, often joking about it himself in interviews and variety segments. And here's the irony that sits at the center of this whole story. Jin's humor and humility may have actually worked against how seriously fans took his musical contributions. Think about it. When someone constantly jokes about their own looks, downplays their own talent, laughs off compliments about their voice or their writing, audiences start to take the joke at face value. They stop looking past it. They stop asking what else might be there. Jin made himself easy to love, but in doing so, he may have made himself easy to underestimate. And that's not a flaw in Jin, that's a blind spot in how fans, and honestly the industry as a whole, tend to categorize idols. We love putting people into single boxes: the visual, the leader, the rapper, the vocalist, the producer, as if a person can only hold one identity at a time. But real artists rarely fit into one box, and Jin has spent over a decade quietly proving that. Here's where the story adds another layer, because it's not just about individual songwriting or composing credits, it's about range. A producer isn't just someone who can write one kind of song well, it's someone who can move between emotional registers, between sonic textures, and still make each one feel authentic. Look at Jin's contributions across BTS's career. There's the raw emotional vulnerability of Awake, the delicate, stripped-back warmth of Moan, the powerhouse vocal drama of Epiphany. Each of these songs asks something completely different from a writer, and Jin delivered on all of them in his own voice without trying to imitate what other members were doing. That's not luck. That's not just having a good voice and getting handed good material. That's range. That's craft. And here's the part that tends to catch people off guard the most. Despite this growing body of work, Jin has rarely, if ever, positioned himself as the group's producer. He's never really campaigned for that title. He's never demanded recognition for it in interviews the way some artists might. He just kept showing up, kept contributing, kept writing songs that meant something without needing the world to applaud the technical achievement behind them. There's something almost quietly rebellious about that. In an industry obsessed with credit, with billing, with who gets called a producer versus who gets called just a member who sings, Jin seemingly never fought that battle. He let the work speak, even when the work wasn't being heard as loudly as it deserved. But maybe that's exactly why this story matters so much right now. Because underrated isn't the same as untalented. Underrated means the talent was always there, just not seen clearly enough, not credited loudly enough, not given the spotlight it earned. And if you go back through BTS's catalog with fresh ears, actually paying attention to which songs carry Jin's fingerprints, you start to hear something different. You start to hear an artist who has been building his own musical identity in plain sight the entire time. The question was never whether Jin could write, could compose, could shape a song from an idea into something that makes millions of people feel something. The question was whether anyone was paying close enough attention to notice. And here's where the story reaches its most important turn. Because if you ask longtime ARMY what Jin's songs actually feel like, a certain word tends to come up again and again. Comfort. Not spectacle, not flash. Comfort. There's a reason for that. Jin has spoken in various interviews over the years about wanting his music to feel like something warm, something honest, something that doesn't try too hard to impress, but instead simply tries to be real. There's a reason for that. Jin has spoken in various interviews over the years about wanting his music to feel like something warm, something honest, something that doesn't try too hard to impress, but instead simply tries to be real. And when you sit with that intention, something clicks into place. Because in an industry that constantly rewards spectacle, bigger drops, flashier hooks, more dramatic vocal runs, Jin chose a different lane. He chose Sincerity as his signature sound. And sincerity in music is one of the hardest things to fake and one of the easiest things to underestimate. Think about Tuna, his self-produced solo track that started as something playful, something almost like an inside joke about his love of fishing, and turned into a genuine fan favorite. It wasn't polished into a title track. It wasn't built for chart domination. It was built because Jin wanted to make something that made people smile. And it worked, not because it was technically the most complex production of his career, but because it was unmistakably, entirely him. That's the emotional core of this whole story. Because being a great producer isn't only about complexity. It isn't only about layering the most intricate arrangement or writing the most technically impressive bridge. Sometimes the hardest and most underrated skill in music is knowing exactly who you are as an artist and having the confidence to let that identity come through clearly, even when it's simple, even when it's soft, even when it doesn't scream for attention. Jin figured that out, quietly, without fanfare, while the world was still busy calling him the visual. And maybe that's the most powerful part of this entire story. Jin never needed the title of producer to prove his worth. He never needed the credit to validate the work. He just kept creating, song after song, year after year, letting his sincerity do the talking, long before the recognition caught up. So here's the real question this video was always building toward. How many other artists are out there quietly doing extraordinary work simply because the world decided who they were before they ever got the chance to show the full picture? Jin's story is a reminder that talent doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it grows patiently in the background, waiting for people to actually stop and listen. So maybe it's time we did exactly that. Maybe it's time we stopped hearing Jin's songs as pleasant additions to an album and started hearing them for what they actually are, the work of a genuine artist who has been shaping BTS's sound for over a decade, one honest song at a time.
If this video changed the way you hear Jin's music, even a little, tell us below. What's your favorite song that Jin had a hand in writing or producing? Because maybe, after everything we just uncovered, it's time his name gets said in the same breath as the word producer, not as a surprise, but as a fact everyone already knew all along.